4th of July. So we will march forward regardless, and we are working our way through the different books of the Bible. So far, we have looked at the books of the law, and as you know, that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. A lot of history there, but of course, Leviticus talks a lot about the different laws and priestly things. And in Deuteronomy is really kind of Moses' farewell address to Israel. And so after he gives that address, he goes up into the mountain, God buries him, and Joshua takes over, which brings us into the books of history. We talked about them last week, at least part of the way. So far, we've covered Joshua and Judges and Ruth. Ruth is a 4-chapter brief love story. It takes place during the days of the Judges, and it introduces us to Ruth, who is not an Israelite. She is, in fact, a Moabite, but she says she will go with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and her God will be her God. And so it's a beautiful story. Then we get into the main history books. There's 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In the original early Hebrew Bible, it was simply 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, as we divide it into 1st and 2nd, well, let's just go 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. 1st Samuel is basically days of Samuel as the main prophet. They demand a king like the other nations, and so Samuel anoints Saul. Saul is very handsome, very tall, what you want your king to look like, so to speak. But he had a bad heart, and I don't mean physically, I mean spiritually. And so God removed him. He had Samuel anoint the young shepherd boy David to be the next king, although David would not be king for another 12, 15 years. But the shepherd boy became the king, and 2nd Samuel is basically his story. 1st Kings is basically Solomon in the early days of the divided kingdom. The 2nd Kings is the rest of the divided kingdom. And if that's not enough information, 1st and 2nd Chronicles goes back and reviews that same history from the southern kingdom's perspective. And so all of it is history. And that brings us up where we left off last week, which is Ezra. You remember that we have no king. Before Samuel, it was every man did that which was right in his own eyes in Judges. Then Samuel comes on the scene. God uses him to be the spiritual leader of the nation. He instructs him to anoint Saul, and then he tells him to anoint David, and then then Samuel passes away during those days, during the days of David. And then we have David as king over the entire nation. Then we have Solomon, the king over the whole nation, son of David. And then we have the kingdom divide. It divided during the days of Solomon's son. His name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam, for all the wisdom God gave Solomon, and some of that wisdom has to be tainted. The wisest man on earth, he married 700 wives and 300 concubines. That is not wisdom. But God did give him wisdom, and Solomon kind of wasted it. His son Rehoboam acted like he had no wisdom. And when it came time to make some decisions as the new king, Rehoboam listened to the wrong leaders. Instead of listening to Solomon's counselors, he listened to his fellows, his buddies who were his age. They gave him horrible advice. And as a result of that, he made a horrible decision, and the 10 northern tribes all seceded. They left. And so that left Rehoboam and his descendants, all descendants of David, that left them with just the tribe of Judah and the very small tribe of Benjamin. The 10 northern tribes, all they went their own way, no influence by David or any of his descendants. There were 6 or 7 different dynasties where a family would take over, and then ultimately they would be killed, and another dynasty would take over. Every king in the north was a bad king. Everyone. It's just a matter of degree of bad. You had bad, you had worse, you had really bad, and then you had really, really, really bad. Ahab would be in that latter category, but there's many others that are not much different. Unfortunately, the kings in the south were somewhat better, but not greatly better. There were some good kings. Josiah, Hezekiah was a pretty good king. There were 3 or 4 pretty good kings. There was another 4 or 5 fair kings, but there was also some horrible kings. I mentioned Hezekiah. He was a good king. He had a son named Manasseh. He would rule for 52 horrible, long, troublesome years because he was a horrible king. And then there was some point of revival, and then ultimately the last kings of the southern kingdom were progressively worse. And so that is the history there at the end of, about 700 BC, the nation of Assyria conquered the surrounding areas and the northern kingdom. They carried off those 10 tribes. We, to this day, 2,700 years later, do not know where they are. There's always some guesses. I've heard guesses such as like, well, those 10 northern tribes are actually British and the United States. I don't think so. Can I thoroughly disprove it? No, because how do you disprove a negative? But the reality is, we don't know where they're at. The best guess is they intermarried, and literally only God knows where they are. That was about 700 BC. About 586 BC, the northern kingdom, let's go. The 586, Babylon had become the big bear on the walk. They devoured Syria. They devoured what Syria owned in the northern kingdom, and then they moved on Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was carried off by, the southern kingdom was carried off by the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, not a nice person, but he was a very powerful king and tremendous general. He won something like 31 battles without losing any. Masterful general, not a nice person. But God used Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to chasten Israel for their lack of trust in God. And that's the significant part. They were chastened. As God had warned them in Deuteronomy, they would be chastened if they left God. And so God allowed them to come. God set a time clock on it. It would be for 70 years. They were in captivity. Daniel was in captivity when he wrote his words. Ezekiel was alive about that same time. Jeremiah was just before that. So there was this nation carried off into captivity. They were for 70 years. Eventually, the Medes and the Persian Empire conquered Babylon and displaced them. And now they're the big dog on the street. And the Persians allowed the Israelites to return to Israel. 70 years are past. They allowed them in waves to rebuild the walls, rebuild the cities, rebuild the temple. The rebuilt temple was nothing like the Temple of Solomon. It was, in fact, the people who had lived from seeing the Temple of Solomon and went back now as elderly people, they looked at the new temple and cried. It was such a poor facsimile of it. It was so much smaller, so much everything, so much poorer. So Ezra was one of those that came back in the waves. When you read the book of Ezra, we're still reading history. And the book of Ezra, it's a relatively short book. I think there's like 14 chapters. It's about the restoration of Judah as the Israelites come back from Babylon. The restoration of Judah, the restoration of Jerusalem after the captivity. There is a break right in the middle of it. The first half of the book is the first return under Governor Zerubbabel and the high priest, whose name was Joshua. Not the Joshua of the book of Joshua. This is many, many years later, lots of years later. But Zerubbabel and Joshua. Governor Zerubbabel. I just like saying his name. Governor Zerubbabel. But he and Joshua were the leaders as they first began to come back to the southern kingdom and rebuild. And then there is something of a 58-year break It's like God tells his first 6 chapters and he takes a 58-year break. Then he finishes the book. And I'll tell you about that break here in just a minute, I think. Esther took place during that time. Remember Esther, born into the kingdom for such a time as this? The Persian assistant, vice governor, whatever he was was very influential with the king, but he hated the Jews. And there was the big story about how he persuaded the king, rather sneakily, I might say, but he persuaded the king that all the Jews were horrible people and they should all be destroyed. And Mordecai was Esther's uncle. He counseled her, you've got to go and talk to the king. You're the queen. You've got to go talk to her, talk to him and change that. And ultimately, God shows how he plays in the book of Esther. It's interesting in that God is never mentioned, and yet you see his fingerprints all the way through the book. Over and over and over, you see God working. But Esther turns out to be the great hero. Mordecai is promoted because of his proper responses. And so we cover the book of Esther. What nation, I asked this last week, what nation is Persia today? Farsi language. They're not Arabs. What nation is it today? Iran. Iran is ancient Persia. They are not Arabian. They are Farsi speaking, and they're not Arab. The nations around them all are, but they are not. They are Muslim, but it's a type of Muslim that doesn't agree with a lot of the other Muslim nations. So anyway, Esther fits right in here in the middle of Ezra. Then God picks up the story in Ezra again, and it is when Ezra returns. Remember, we had Zerubbabel and Joshua first wave, then Ezra comes in the second part, and so we see Ezra being involved there. Nehemiah, the next book, is a record of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem despite all kinds of opposition and threatenings of attack. The local people in the area now don't want the Jews back. They try all kinds of chicanery and trickery to try to make it such that the Persian king would withdraw his permission. One of the things that's interesting about this period of time, Cyrus was the leader, and Cyrus actually found his name in the Word of God saying that he would do this. And when he saw that, he was terribly impressed and said, well, then I must do this. And so that was part of the working of how God put that together. So Nehemiah builds the walls in spite of opposition. In some ways, a lot of preachers find this a very encouraging book because building the walls with all kinds of opposition is still a thing. There's still many attacks and threats against the people of God. And then at the last part of the book of Nehemiah, there is a great revival under the leadership of both Ezra and Nehemiah. We see a great turning back to God. And that brings us to the end of the history books. Now, that's not to say there's not some history in the other books, particularly the books of the law. There's quite a bit of history in Genesis and Exodus and Numbers. There's quite a bit there, but they are considered the law books. The history books were the ones we talked about this morning, beginning as early as Joshua and Judges and then all the way through Ezra and Nehemiah. So what book comes after Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther? The book of Job. Book of Job. It is not Job. Many people think it is. It is not Job. It is Job. And we're going to see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books of poetry. God's word is made up of all kinds of figures of speech. There is allegory. In fact, Paul wrote to the Galatians, this is an allegory, and he explains the law and grace and how they are different, and how that the different things of the law are pictures of what God's going to do in times of grace. But we have Job, Psalm, and Proverbs, which are pretty obvious. That also includes Ecclesiastes, Solomon, and Lamentations. Lamentations does follow the book of Jeremiah, but we're going to pull it ahead a couple of books so that we can include it with the books of poetry. So let's go through these. There are these several books. The primary characteristics of biblical poetry is what we sometimes would call a parallel structure. The good one is this, the bad one is that. You see it especially in Proverbs a lot. And it will put a lot of times two opposites, but sometimes it will put two similars. Two thoughts are put in relationship to each other. In the Psalms, many of the verses are a combination of two thoughts that either support or contrast each other as you read through many of the Psalms. And that literary structure of pairing gives an immediate context in which we can interpret what God is trying to tell us. The obedient are blessed, the disobedient are judged. That type of thing is throughout the books of Psalms and Proverbs. But let's talk about Job first. He's the first one of the books of poetry. Job in history probably took place about chapter 12 or 14 of Genesis. The entire book of Job, all 42 chapters, records a history of about 2 or 3 weeks. The entire 42 chapters is about 2 or 3 weeks. The opening describes when the devil wants to destroy Job, and God gives him permission to go so far, and then his supposed friends come to try to encourage him, and their method of encouragement was basically, well, it's all your fault, Job. If you'd been more spiritual, this wouldn't have happened. Unfortunately, in the Christian world today, there are friends like that. Not terribly helpful, and they will find a certain amount of chastening that will follow them. But after this goes back several times, as Job will talk, and then one of these three will talk, and then Job will talk, and then one of these three will talk. And the vast majority of the book, out of the 42 chapters, probably about 38 of them are this back and forth between Job and his friends. And then finally, there's a young man who's not one of the three who offers his perspective of things. And then God steps in the last 2 or 3 chapters. And God says, okay, this is the way it is. And that settles it. When God speaks, that settles it. And God ultimately reckons judgment on those 3 friends. He rebukes them. He rebukes the young man after them. He eventually gives back Job all that he had before, and restores him to a place of great respect and great honor. He replaces all the cattle, all the camels, all the sheep, all his wealth. But Job lost 10 children. God gives him 10 more children. Some people might say, well, why didn't he give him 20 if he was giving him everything else? The first 10 kids are eternal. The second kings are eternal. None of the rest is eternal. And so he doubled the amount of kids because they are all continue. They all did, the first 10 all died in the book, of course. And so Job describes this experience, a righteous man, a godly man who suffers many hardships. There are preachers today that will say hardships come because you're not giving enough to the church. That is so bogus. That is so wrong. Judgment happens, but godly people suffer as well. Some of the most godly Christians I've met in my long Christian life have been some of the ones who have suffered the most. They've had little. They've been faithful in spite of it. They have seen hardship after hardship after hardship. And many times it's almost like we're watching Job all over again. God has a purpose in that. Sometimes we don't know what it is, but God does have a purpose in that. There is a school of affliction that God sometimes enrolls us in. And that affliction can cause us to trust God or to reject God. There is a certain trying that goes on. Some Christians flunk completely. Other Christians, much like Job, say, God, why are you doing this? God has a purpose that we do not see. I have seen many times when a believer is serving God faithfully, that God allows them to go through a period of brokenness and sorrow to prepare them for what they are going to do. And virtually every major Bible character you can think of has gone through that in some degree. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt and literally a slave, but he was rescued from that and lived in the house of Pharaoh. But his people suffered. God called him when he's out there on the backside of the desert hiding from the Pharaoh. God called him and spoke to him out of a burning bush. Uh, it was not unusual for a bush to burn. What was unusual about this bush was it did not burn up. It just kept burning and burning and burning. You ever had one of those gas fireplaces? You can just flip the switch and the fireplace works just beautiful. You don't have to put any logs on it at all. We can pretend that's a burning bush, I guess. Not that it is, just a wayward thought. But God breaks people sometimes, and he brings them to the place where they're very malleable in his hand. We talk about the Jeremiah talks about the potter, and he talks about that we are the clay in God's hands. And he molds us and shapes us and fashions us. And then what happens? He puts it in the fire. It hardens it. It strengthens it. It makes it more dependable. And then it's glazed and painted, and it turns out to be this beautiful pot. That's what God does to us in a spiritual sense. And Job is a story of God doing exactly that. God allowed him. There are people who say, why does God cause all this evil? God does not cause any evil. Never. Sometimes we wonder, where are you, God, when the evil comes? But God hasn't gone anywhere. We can be sure that God is there, fully involved, fully aware, knowing what's going to happen before it does. God's fully aware of all of that. God has many times put his people in the fire, and it is a necessary step in growth. I have never been fond of chastening, but if we're never chastened, we never learn what's right. We have to endure some of those things. And yes, when the trials of fire come in our lives as believers, it is not pleasant. In fact, it can really knock us off of every base we have. And yet it is a necessary part of growth. If we're going to grow, we have to endure that school of affliction. There's many a person who went through high school and said, I barely could survive it. Yeah, some classes are tough. Some classes are hard. And it's necessary to get to the place where you learn that God's in control. I am his servant. I am his child, and God will work in the way that is necessary. Job suffered many hardships. He lost all of his possessions, not most of them. He lost it all. He lost his family. It was down to just him and his wife. And at one point, his wife says, Job, just curse God and die. Great support there. Many times we don't have a lot of support, but God is always working what needs to be done. And then he loses his health, his possessions, his family, and then his health. Sometimes God goes right straight to the health. Sometimes he deals with it in those regards. I cannot say that I am fond of having diabetes for 25 years. I can't say I'm fond knowing that I've dealt with cancer and the same kind of cancer that killed my dad. I'm not fond of thinking of those things, but at the same time, I can look back and I can see God has taught me several things along the way. Lessons I needed to know. And as far as the diabetes, I've learned a great deal about what to eat and what not to eat, which is probably something I needed to learn. As far as the cancer is concerned, one of the most memorable parts of it was sitting in the waiting room, waiting for my turn at the radiation. I think Chris is familiar with that process. Sitting there waiting for my turn in the radiation. I had 35 treatments over 35 business days. I think Chris has had way more than that. But I remember sitting in that waiting room waiting for my turn. It's really a quick process, and it's really pretty simple. But you have radiation blasting into wherever that cancer is. And I'm sitting there thinking, my cancer is very possible to be dealt with. My chances of surviving it for many years is rather high. But sitting there in that waiting room, I saw many a person come in that had cancer of the throat. You don't do surgery on your throat unless you plan on living on a feeding tube the rest of your life. Some that had cancer in the brain that had basically gone as far as it can go. There was others that had cancers of another kind or another that were overwhelming cancers. I remember a good friend. He came to church here many years ago. He had cancer of the throat. Radiation didn't seem to help a whole lot. He tried some of these experimental things in the Southwest, Mexico, and so forth. It didn't work. He came back. The doctor says, we're out of bullets. There's nothing left to do. And I remember visiting him in his hospital room there by his dad. Him and his wife were there in the room. And I came in to talk with him a little bit. We'd become quite close. And we talked about what was coming and what it was like and all so forth. And I remember standing there by his bedside and his head in my arms, just crying. It's taught me something about sympathy, something about empathy, something about the pains that others have. And I can say I've been very blessed in spite of all of the health issues. And that's why I go back. Some of the greatest Christians I've ever met have had serious health issues. There's something about it that draws you either closer to God or drives you from God. Those that drive them from God do not know what they're missing. Those who drive to God, there are blessings that can't really be explained other than God's done something. And so Job is the picture book of that. His friends tried to convince him his misfortunes were due to sin in his life, but he maintained he was innocent. I've confessed. I'm not aware of anything I haven't confessed. I'm not innocent in with sinlessness, but he said, I've confessed. I have confessed. I have been in prayer. I've talked to God about it much. He maintained his innocence. Sometimes, and this is a hard statement, sometimes Christians have done all the right things and the horrible disease comes anyway. And it's not because they've done something wrong. It is because God is doing something in their life that they can't fathom what it is yet. There's a story in the Bible about Jesus healing a blind man. The disciples asked him, who sinned, his parents or him, that he's blind? We know that illness comes because we have a sin nature. We will have diseases. Ultimately, our body will die physically. And so the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, his parents or him? And Jesus says, neither. Neither his parents nor he sinned. It was so that God could be glorified when he healed him. Sometimes the purposes that we see are not the ones that we are expecting. Sometimes God does something in a person's life or their health to demonstrate his power and his glory, that God can even raise the dead. When Lazarus died in John chapter 11, his sisters wept and cried bitterly because Lazarus has died and Jesus is just a few miles away. Why did he not come? Did Lazarus sin? Did Mary and Martha sin? Not in that. They did get discouraged. Martha and Mary, when Jesus came, they said, if he'd only been here, he wouldn't have died. We know you can heal him, but his purpose was not to heal him. His purpose was to resurrect him. It wasn't because any of the three of them had sinned. It was so that God could demonstrate his power. Sometimes illness is about that. God is demonstrating his power. The book of Job contains a great deal of dialogue between Job and his three friends. But in the end, God vindicates Job and he restores all of his prosperity. He has double what he had to start with. At no point do you see where Job has sinned. What you do see, though, as you read through that book, is you see Job growing spiritually as he goes through the book. The Job of chapter 40 is not the Job of chapter 2. There is a growth that takes place during some of the most horrible persecutions and trials and health issues that you can imagine. Move on to Psalms. If I take 20 minutes on each book, do the math, there's 66 of them. We're not going to take 33 weeks to do this. We could, and maybe it would be beneficial, but we're not going to do that right now. We're going to try to go through these. The books of poetry. There is a poetic part of the Bible, a poetic story of the Bible. In Psalms, I've heard preachers say Psalms, if you want to learn to be holy, read Psalms. There is a great power in the book of Psalms. It is a collection of 150 songs. Virtually every psalm in the Bible can be put to music. Unfortunately, we don't know the music that the Hebrews used 3,000 years ago, but they can be sung. We've tried to put some of them to music, and I think they're wonderful. But David wrote about half of them. Some of the other writers of Psalms include Moses, Solomon. Solomon wrote several. A man named Asaph. You will see him mentioned in our study Bible. There are 8 kinds of Psalms. This is something maybe you didn't know. I really didn't think about it. But it's something, there are 8 different kinds of Psalms. Let me give you what they are and some examples. There are hymns. For example, Psalm 113 and 150 are hymns. There are laments. A lament is a sad song. The book of Lamentations is sadness over the destruction of Jerusalem. Laments, Psalms 42 and 43, sadness, sad songs. There are thanksgiving psalms, such as Psalm 56 and Psalm 100. Psalm 100, let us give joy, let's praise God, thank God, let's give him thanks. So hymns, laments, thanksgiving psalms, psalms of confidence. Psalms of confidence. Psalm 11 is an example. Songs of confidence. Psalm 11 is an example. There are psalms of remembrance. That word remember, why does God keep telling us to remember, to remember, to remember? Because we forget. We need to be reminded regularly. I've had people say, when did you make that announcement? Well, it was in your bulletin in 2 places. I mentioned it in 4 different services, and I never heard about it. We can forget so easily. We can hear a statement, turn around, walk out the door, and have forgotten it entirely. We have that capability. A psalm of remembrance would be a psalm of 105. And in that case, God is telling Israel, remember what God has done for you. One of the greatest exercises you can do for your faith is to remember what God has already done, what he did for Israel and what he has done in your own life already. The book of Hebrews chapter 11 is a great chapter on what God has done in the lives of so many specific individuals. A psalm of remembrance, 105, I said. There are psalms of wisdom. They're not quite proverbs, but they are songs of wisdom. For example, Psalm 1 and Psalm 12. Remember, Psalm 1 talks about the man who stands, sits, and read Psalm 1. It's a great psalm. There you go. It's that one. It is that one. Blessed is the man who sits not in the counsel of the ungodly. Psalm 1, great psalm of wisdom. Psalm 12 is another one. And then there are kingship psalms, songs about the king of kings and the king. Psalms like 20 and 93. 20 and 93. And then there is what's called imprecatory psalms. I would love to tell you what that means, but I don't know. Imprecatory psalms. They are, for example, Psalms 10 and 69. Maybe if I look at it, I'll know what it's talking about. Psalm number 10, for example, is an imprecatory psalm. Psalm 10. Let's see what he's saying here. The Lord is in his holy temple. His throne is in the heaven. On the wicked he shall rain snares. In Psalm 69, I'm not really seeing what they're talking about here, but Psalm 69 is another one. Look at that. Isn't Google helpful? A psalm of calling down God's judgment. Imprecatory psalms, 10 and 69. Well, I've only given you about a dozen psalms there, but all the rest of them are going to fit in one of those categories.
It's derived from the Latin word imprecatory, which invokes a curse or prayer evil against.
So it'd be kind of like Elisha, and he says, God, send fire down to heaven and consume him and his 50. That would be an imprecatory one. There are some times where that would be a nice power to have. Sometimes I get a little jealous of Elisha when he had that power. God, just fry that one. But that's not our job. God reminds us, vengeance is mine. He will take vengeance. He will do his job. And the most encouraging part of that is he always does so much better than we could. So much better. Let him do it. So, imprecatory psalms. All right. They are written by and for Israelites in a different time than ours, of course. Israel became a nation with Abraham. Abraham lived roughly 2000 BC. We're now about 2000 AD. Israel has been a nation for about 4,000 years since God promised the land to Abraham. And so the Psalms were written to the Israelites in a different time. Their practices of worship had to do with a temple or a tabernacle, and so there was different practices. But in spite of that, the Psalms have a completely universal appeal to any believer, and that's why they are so important. Today, we find the Psalms to be a great source of comfort, of worship, of challenge, of encouragement. They are very much a blessing. Blessed is the people whose God is the Lord, is right out of the Psalms. And so we've covered a whole two books of poetry. I'm not exactly making great progress here. We'll talk about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes next week, work our way through. I hope these little snippets of explanation help make it a little easier to read these different books and understand what the main thrust of them is. There are many lessons that we find as we read through them, but I think we're going to stop right here for this morning. So let's take a break. I'm not going to dismiss and say go home. I'm going to say go take a break, get some coffee, come back in here in about 12, 15 minutes, and we'll start all over again. And so we'll look at our message.